Thank you very much indeed. Everyone can hear, I hope? Good. Well, thank you very much, Leanne, for mentioning the review panel, which, by the way, is now hosted by the Brooklyn Public Library. Any of you who've been to that series will know that we review exhibitions where the audience has always been given advance notice and had a chance to see the show. And so the discussion, the review panel, has the advantage that much of the audience has seen the show, and certainly all of the panel, hopefully, and also a quick video will refresh memory or fill you in on what we're talking about, and then it'll stimulate you to go see the show. Tonight we're doing, this is the first ever live art review which takes as its subject a book, and that presents opportunities and challenges. And yes, we are reviewing, as you all know, I hope, The World New Made, Figurative Painting in the 20th Century by the British painter and critic and curator Timothy Hyman. So our structure this evening is such that we will give you a brief characterization of this book and why we feel it's important enough to be reviewing it. We will then, we've then decided among ourselves on a representative selection, segments from the book that will give the character of Hyman's approach, as well as taking us in depth into some of his subtle arguments and descriptions that really give you the meat of the book, or at least some of the tidbits of the book, hopefully stimulating a later reading of it. And then we'll conduct a more critical discussion, by which time the audience is equipped with some acquaintance of the book, its scope, and its character. So that's our approach. And bear with us, we have some images. All of the images that I'm showing are reproduced in the book. They are Timothy Hyman's selection of images. And they go with the readings, and they also complement the readings by showing some of the scope of what's not quite included. So, the title, The World New Made, I think it comes from, that comes from a great American painter, whose name I've forgotten. Bad start. But such is the nature of a 200-page book. Marsden Hartley. So the quote is from Hartley. It's a Thames and Hudson book. Thames and Hudson, the great British art publishing house that's given us the concise histories of so many subjects and the World of Art series. They have a kind of encyclopedic quality, many of their books. And the title, Figurative Painting in the 20th Century, certainly has that defiant breadth of scope that one expects a kind of almost encyclopedic approach. But I think it's fair to say Hyman gives us the very opposite, doesn't he? How would we characterize his project? Julie.
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me, giving me the opportunity to read this wonderful book, which I, for the most part, loved. But it was really like spending, a couple days with old friends. He had that kind of approach to it, and meeting some new ones that you might want to argue with. And that kind of close-up and personal relationship to the subject matter, no bones about necessarily being objective. His scholarship was top-notch, so you didn't feel like as though he was just gushing. But I really loved falling into this armchair, this cozy armchair of a book, and was really grateful to him for having bothered to write it and sort of write or balance out the art after 1900, edited by Rosalind Krauss.
Yeah, it's an avuncular tone, isn't it, David? What is its scope, do you think?
Well, I feel it's a very personal selection, and in many ways I found it to be a kind of self-portrait from the range of people that he could have chosen in the 20th century. He chose those that cleaved toward his own interest in narrative painting, in the self, and into a psychological, sexual, philosophical point of view that threads itself through the book.
Yeah.
That's nicely said.
Nicely summarized, yeah. So his approach, his method, is one that gives us in 5 chapters a scope of the subject which manages to be in equal measure thematic and chronological. The chapters generally take us, it's a bit like a boat on turbulent waters. We get the sense of moving forward, but there's a belligerent refusal of any sense of an evolution towards something, and that's, I think, a very strong philosophical theme of his approach anyway, an anti-formalist, anti-modernist in some ways approach to modern art.
In many ways, you could say it's an anti-ism.
Anti-ism book, yes. It's people.
Well,
It's people,
it's
it's
a
individual visions,
Yes.
and people who would go their own way against the marketplace, against academe.
And against fashion, so therefore
Yes.
it's appropriate that when you have a chapter right at the beginning of the chapter 1 is after Cubism, reinventing the language of representation, and we've already seen images of a very late Leger painting from 1954, the Campers, and a very early 11:30, the poet, 3:30, the poet, by Marc Chagall, that it's telling that chapter should conclude with Paul Arago, so it takes us right up to the present. The commentary on that moment, the commentary about that moment is not faithful to Chronos, it's faithful to the theme, to the muse, as it were.
And what you got so poignantly was how every single one of these artists had felt great quotes. It's definitely worth picking up this book just to revel in these quotes. But how every single one of these artists was struggling with the stranglehold that abstraction had placed on them, and they were in the midst of the dominance of abstraction. And it was interesting to me how many of them had breakdowns, and of course these were tumultuous times, but the idea that you're constantly, your urge to do, go past the ism, to pull something out of yourself is, always banging up against the brick wall of modernism.
Yeah.
Well, a good number of the artists, of course, are expressionists, like Munch and Ensor and others. But since everyone's looking at the Chagall, one of the themes for me that threads through the book is what I would infer from Timothy's choices, that there is an underlying symbolism in the sense that paintings like the one you're looking at are about an epiphany, about a moment of realization in which the character depicted is jettisoned outside himself to some sense of the world or some sense of the beyond self.
Yes.
And I think that's something that in many of the artists he comes around to talking about, and it's one of the things I found interesting.
And his line,
And compelling.
Hyman's line that Chagall fused Cubism with El Greco. I just thought
Yes.
that was so lovely, speaking of getting out of yourself.
Yeah, to grab a movement, an ism from the 20th century, and then fuse with actually a marginalized figure for many centuries from the depths of art history, an old master, would, I think, again typify that for Hyman it's the eccentrics, it's the outliers, it's the outsiders, and even when it's canonical figures, it's often, the fact that the Leger is from 54 and the Chagall is from before he really develops his idiom, often he's quite harsh about the stylistics of major figures that we're familiar with, and goes and retrieves from them a moment of epiphany or a moment of crisis, a moment of doubt or a moment of discovery.
Marsden Hartley was 61 before he did those figurative pieces. And it was like he was waiting his entire life to plunge into that, self-examination.
And it's almost a fairly sort of shameless plundering by Hyman of that minority bit of an artist that backs up his feelings about, or what he takes to be strongest about that artist.
Well, he does that again and again in choosing not the whole career of an artist,
Yes.
but just those parts that concern him. Even his good friend Ron Katai gets roasted in many ways, and then a few periods that he really adores, he singles out. And his criticism is very nuanced, and he doesn't let go of any of his ambivalences. They're all right there.
Right.
And certainly even an icon like Edward Hopper's Nighthawks,
Yes.
which maybe we'll talk about later.
Yeah. Well, inevitably, as we try to characterize the book in neutral terms, we are impassioned readers, and our own critical voice is quite rightly coming to bear on the subject. So I think it's a moment to pull back and allow Timothy Hyman's voice into the discussion to give our audience. By the way, I know that some of you have read Hyman's book, even though it's only been out a few months. Don't be shy. Raise your hands if you've read a good section of this book or all of it. It'd be very interesting to know, just to get some characterization.
Barely a peep.
Okay. Well, I know that one or two of you are being shy or bashful. I know that Svetlana Alpers is particularly shy and bashful by nature, so she didn't put her hand up, but she has admitted to me that she has the book. So anyway, right. So 5 chapters, as I say, and I think we're going to plunge into a segment from chapter 2, which is titled After Expressionism, the New Thingness. And here he deals with those artists, some of those artists characterized with as the Neue Sachlichkeit, the new objectivity painters, and a rather beautiful description of this painting, the portrait of the journalist Sylvia von Harden from 1926. After the Trench, which is one of his more gritty, Dada-like early collage-based paintings, after the Trench had been exhibited, Dix abandoned painting for 6 months to complete what is arguably his greatest achievement, the etching cycle Der Krieg, the War. In 50 aquatints, published as 5 portfolios in 1924, Dix relives every aspect of his wartime experience, using corrosive acid to soil and wound the plate to replicate the rot of corpses. That winter, traveling for several weeks in Italy, he was excited by Bronzino's high-gloss Medici portraits in the Mannerist style. By 1925, Dix had become famous, and at his dealer's insistence moved to Berlin, where he would paint most of the sequence of Weimar portraits for which he is today best known. Portraits that bring each individual character into focus with unsurpassed vividness, while collectively conjuring a doomed society. The journalist, Sylvia von Harden, painted in 1926, emerges in contorted elegance from her envelopment in shocking pink, defiantly androgynous in boy's haircut and monocle, the apparition of the new woman as cafe intellectual. Even the smoke from her pink-tipped cigarette is pink. Painting on wood, tempera under drawing, overlaid by elaborate oil glazing. Dix's technique is not homage, but parody, marrying his German forebears with Bronzino. He exaggerates just those elements, their viscous, slimy surfaces, their sick-to-death intensity that induce revulsion. And this is George Gross, his drawing The Seated Toads. After German defeat, after the Russian Revolution, after the street battles, the right-wing putsches and the workers' republics, questions of the artist's role in society became urgent for German painters of all persuasions. In 1919, Paul Klee wrote to Alfred Kubin, "Ephemeral though the Communist Republic seemed from the outset, it was not without its positive consequences. Of course, any extreme individualistic art is not suited for general consumption, but we should be able to convey the results of our inventive activity to the mass of the people. This new art could then spread into the crafts and bring forth a great flowering, and so the Workers' Republic has taught us a great deal. Clay would become a key teacher at the Bauhaus, where leftist utopianism became fused with a formalist aesthetic. A purist creed, actively combated by Gross in his 1925 text, Art is in Danger, written with Wieland Herzfelder. He rebukes his abstract counterparts as, quote, wanderers into the void, quote, whether these artists believe their work has no deeper meaning, or whether they impart to it an emotional or metaphysical meaning, they intentionally renounce all the artist's possibilities of ideological influence in the areas of eroticism, religion, politics, aesthetics, morality, etc., standing silent and indifferent, that is, irresponsibly.
Yeah. And that seems to be a sentiment that many of the artists had.
Yeah. Those two contrasted views of art offer a stark choice. A room full of Gross and Dix can induce a sense of overkill, up to our necks in excrement. A room of Bauhaus works might seem a relief from all that verist ugliness, yet an inadequate response to the catastrophic events unfolding around them. It will be the special role of Max Beckmann's art after 1930 to offer pictorial structures that acknowledge both social reality and void, both thingness and the metaphysical, and thereby to move painting beyond that impasse in what he himself called a transcendental Sachlichkeit. By the late 1920s, in Paris for part of each year, absorbing Léger's black lines, Matisse's arabesques, Picasso's monumentality, Beckmann discovers in himself an art of affirmation. The angular has become curved, the forms larger, more generous, more architectonic. On a dark ground, at first blue or red, but usually black, Beckmann has learnt to spread buttery paint with a relaxed, almost offhand finesse, realizing arm or breast as a wonderfully tangible surface, the most flesh-like paint of the 20th century. It was as though the fabled quest for a synthesis of German and Hellenic might at last be fulfilled. In 1932, Beckmann began the first of the 9 triptychs on which his reputation chiefly rests. The general scheme of departure is clear enough. Between 2 panels depicting suffering, the middle opens into a calm sea. The form of the triptych has allowed him to bring together both the urgent horror of the night and the sensual pleasures of his Parisian works, and to place them in a dialectical relation. One text to set beside departure is Nietzsche's famous passage in The Birth of Tragedy, where Raphael's divided transfiguration is made to signify both Dionysian pain, quote, the sole ground of being, as well as the Apollonian realm emerging from it, quote, a new illusory world invisible to those enmeshed in the first. We are shown, writes Nietzsche, how there is need for a whole world of torment in order for the individual to produce the redemptive vision and to sit quietly in his rocking rowboat in mid-sea, absorbed in contemplation. So much of Hyman's emphasis is on artists that we might see as marginal, might generally be considered offbeat or marginal in general surveys or standard art history books, and many of these reflect his particular tastes and interests as a scholar and as a painter. Hyman was the chief curator, the guest curator at the Tate of exhibitions of the Indian painter Bhupen Khaka and of Sir Stanley Spencer, and he's written books on Bonnard and on Sienese painting, and he's lectured on both subjects, incidentally, here at the New York Studio School. And so I just want to give a kind of visual representation to a core central chapter of the book that I'm skipping over in terms of red sections, because the arguments, I think, are a little too involved and complex to benefit from an excised segment. But Stanley Spencer is definitely a central figure in that. That central chapter is, chapter 3, is titled First Person Painting. And it's that declarative, personal, autobiographical, it could be said, or placing the self as the subject without necessarily being autobiographical, that's really quite key to Hyman's sense of the figurative in the 20th century. We're looking here at Frida Kahlo, for instance, Alice Neal, and the subject of his monograph, Bonnard, and a particularly beautiful, very complex narrative involved in his telling of it. The great Charlotte Salamon's life, or what is that? Leben und
Life and Theater.
Life and Theater. Leben, yes, Life or Theater. And this is one of the, she painted over 1,600 plates that go with that book. But I want to move on to the section called Beyond the Formalist Canon, Visionaries, Dreamers, Outsiders, which is another key aspect of his approach. Yes. And this is a fairly long section. Oh,
but it is one that's key to Hyman's.
Pretty key, and one that we'll be wanting to talk about. Some of the 20th century's most vivid imagery has been the work of visionaries or outsiders, exceptionals, who cannot easily be inserted into any account of painting's quote-unquote progress, yet who together stake out new territory for artists. Each embodies a challenge to exclusionary orthodoxies, whether academic or formalist. Each affirms a role for the solitary image maker, creating ambitious projects and narratives independent of the art world mainstream. Modernism, defined by the Mexican writer Octavio Paz as the revolt of suppressed realities, often took a psychological turn. The honoring of dream and the unconscious, a recognition that we may be most fully ourselves when not in our waking mind, transformed 20th century painting. Of the dream, wrote Jung in 1911, it may truly be said, the stone that the builders rejected has become the head of the corner. The impact of surrealism, assisted by the growth of art publishing and color reproduction, helped lift out of obscurity several forgotten fantastic artists, singularities such as Hercules Sagers or Richard Dadd. In that spirit, the American painter Leon Golub often insisted that, quote, true modernism began not in Paris but in Ostend in the 1880s, the decade in which James Ensor completed all his most significant works. And we're looking at the Tribulations of St. Anthony of 1887, which hangs majestically at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, where each new generation of painters from de Kooning and Guston to Paul Arago and Dana Schutz has drawn inspiration from Ensor's reconciliation of modernist painting with a complex literary imagery. Many artists before Ensor had depicted the legend of St. Anthony, the earliest desert father who separates himself from mankind and seeks solitude, only to be tormented by the world he carries within him. As in Hieronymus Bosch's great Lisbon triptych of 1515, Antony is depicted by Ensor hunched over his holy book, peering uneasily behind him as the void fills with self-generated monsters. Ensor, working alone through long silent days in his fifth-floor attic high above the family's carnival shop, conjures a more visceral language for his own tribulations, a disquieting imagery neither nocturnal nor fiery, but high-keyed, focused around the central swamp or waterfall of white. He transfers the beautiful nacreous palette of his seascapes and still lives to his inner wilderness. Broken pinks become rose reds, though always set against that ridged and seamed, impastoed whiteness. Lead white becomes a substance independent of any descriptive function, into which Ensor zigzags the end of his brush as a kind of seismic doodling. And out of this matrix there emerges wonderful miasmas of hallucinatory imagery. The longer we look, the more we discover. Insects and polyps morphing into demons, the animal-headed creature bearing a lyre, merging with the red-haired woman at the cafe table. A hot air balloon with a face, and in its basket a flayed figure. Enemas, projectile vomit, a ship of fools, bottoms that become faces, witches on broomsticks. The familiar imagery of the Flemish carnival is here recast to suggest the unbounded and anarchic freedom of the individual imagination. It was also in 1887 that an enormous canvas by the 25-year-old Georges Seurat, a Sunday afternoon on the island of La Grande Jatte, took the Belgian art world by storm, converting many to divisionist procedures. Ensor railed against this, quote, art of cold calculation, dry and repellent. He especially resented the claim of divisionism to be the true painting idiom, equivalent to the libertarian anarchist tenets Ensor himself espoused. The following year, he embarked upon his own over 14-foot refutation, the entry of Christ into Brussels of 1889, a disorderly carnival realized with an utterly unpredictable wildness of mark. Ensor's paintings and etchings of the 1880s became widely known only in the 20th century. In 1906, the young Paul Klee became fascinated by the autonomy of Ensor's line, sending him 2 etchings of his own. And in 1911, Emile Nolde visited Ensor in Ostend. By mid-century, his art had become an essential component within the modernist canon, while remaining outside any movement. Almost a century after Ensor's tribulations, Ken Kiff in London made his own assertion of the inward imagination. In Talking with a Psychoanalyst, Night Sky, 73-9, which we're seeing here, the mild-faced patient is Kiff himself. And he and the shadowy analyst become polarized, the room fills behind him with grotesque presences, pouring in through the half-open door. Huge-nosed, multi-testicled, bestial, or bowler-hatted. On the floor, perhaps suggesting the potential violence of this transaction, are a saw, a hammer, and a pitchfork. When, in his mid-20s, Kiff had first begun to paint fantasy pictures, he'd experienced a sense of helplessness. The images that appeared were often extremely frightening. He had needed help, began seeing a psychotherapist whose orientation was broadly Jungian. It wasn't merely an intellectual adventure, as Kiff later insisted. I wasn't right in the head. Those sessions put him on easier terms with his imagination and taught him to avoid closure on any one interpretation. He wrote of receiving moral support from his analyst, but also, especially relevant to this image, that the analyst provided a polarity. And in thinking about the prevalence of the self in art over the past century, he saw it as an assertion of the individual against negativity, against the collective and the corporate, but also more generally against the not-self. It's like a discovery. It's an unknown. It isn't self-aggrandizement. An image of oneself in the painting never completely represents oneself. For Kiff, each painting was the outcome of a complex exchange between an underlying abstract stratum of color and potentiality and the figurative image that eventually emerged from it. The hill was yellow now, but if it stayed yellow, it might not stay a hill, and if it stayed a hill, it might not stay yellow. And the final chapter of the book is one titled After Abstract Expressionism, towards a new history of a painting, in which, in a way, the fulminating antagonism towards modernism, towards formalism, towards big systems comes to a head, and some marginalized figures, both from within and from without the canon, emerge as counterbalances to formalist orthodoxy. And he starts with a couple of epigraphs to this chapter, one from de Kooning. In Genesis, it is said, "In the beginning was the void, and God acted upon it." For an artist, that is clear enough. It is so mysterious that it takes away all doubt. You can float in it, fly in it, suspend in it, and today it seems to tremble in its to tremble in it is maybe best, or anyhow very fashionable. And Philip Guston in 1970, "American abstract art is a lie, a sham, a cover-up for a poverty of spirit, a mask to mask the fear of revealing oneself." When the increasingly doctrinaire critic Clement Greenberg told de Kooning, quote, "It is impossible today to paint a face," the artist replied, "That's right, and it's impossible not to." So the impossible figure, wrenched out of the matrix of the pictorial field, an idea already latent in many 20th century painters from Picasso to Beckmann, was fulfilled in de Kooning's Woman One. At the beginning of its long gestation, he had seen the 1950 Soutine retrospective at the Museum of Modern Art. Although painted from life, Soutine's figure images remained exemplary for de Kooning, even as he became subsumed within abstract expressionism, ABEX, along with Arshile Gorky, Jackson Pollock, Philip Guston, and Franz Klein, with Mark Rothko, Clifford Still, and Barnett Newman as another grouping, all familiar to one another and all emerging into the spotlight together over the course of a decade. The structures of European culture, of Western civilization, have been devastated by the two world wars. Even if Paris remained physically intact, even if significant paintings were still emerging from Picasso and Matisse, Léger and Balthus, there was no longer the sense of a cohesive European modernist painting. In the 1940s, the New York painters had inherited existentialism. As de Kooning recalled, it was in the air. Without knowing too much about it, we were in touch with the mood. That mood was essentially tragic. Politically, of the anti-Stalinist left, utopian socialists shading into anarchists, the abstract expressionist painters were at odds with McCarthyite America, their isolation reinforced by an absence of either patronage or market for their paintings. When Harold Rosenberg and Clement Greenberg began to write on these artists, they were championing a small subculture within a vast, blandly Philistine nation. And although Hyman then segues into the story of CIA funding of modern art, he rounds up by saying, inflated, most famously by Greenberg, a former Trotskyite who now sat on the executive committee of the Congress for Cultural Freedom, one of the CIA fronts, American abstract painting was raised up as the evolutionary culmination of all previous painting. With ABEX enthroned on an imperial orthodoxy, 20th century non-abstract art was marginalized, rendered invisible. In Robert Storr's formulation, quote, Greenberg deprived subsequent generations of their true intellectual heritage. And then enter Guston. Philip Guston, sometime disciple of the Mexican muralists, admirer of Beckmann and de Chirico, found himself trapped in a false position. His beautiful, informal brush marks taken to be the quintessence of art for art's sake. Already in 1960, he was articulating his discomfort. There's something ridiculous and miserly in the myth we inherit from abstract art, that painting is autonomous, pure, and for itself. But painting is impure. We are image makers and image-ridden. In these same years, a younger generation rose in open rebellion against ABEX, initially under the umbrella of pop. Guston condemned the soulless commercialism of early pop art, and de Kooning, when he met Warhol, burst out, "You're a killer of art. You're a killer of beauty. You're even a killer of laughter. I can't bear your work. The strange, painful transition made by Guston in the years 1965 to 67 will be explored in detail later. After many years of abstraction, he re-emerged in his hooded clansmen, his heaps, his smoking and drinking selves, as the great serio-comic carnivalesque painter of the second half of the 20th century. The comic strip visionary Robert Crumb felt the affinity. It was as though we'd both tapped into this great grungy unconscious, all the unconscious imagery of lower middle class America. Just as the tragicomic art of Goya and Gilray was a corrective to the hegemony of neoclassical taste at the end of the 18th century, so the grotesque hilarity of such paintings as Painting, Smoking, Eating in the 1970s broke in upon cool American formalism, whether of the Greenbergian or the Warholian variety. The scandal of Guston's later canvases was that they came not from some young marginal, but from one of the Abex masters. In 1953, when de Kooning first exhibited his Woman series, there had been a shocked response, though Woman 1 was swiftly purchased by the Museum of Modern Art. But in 1970, on the night Guston at last exhibited his new imagery at the Marlborough Gallery in New York, the outrage was far greater. De Kooning was one among the few to approach him, saying, "You know, Philip, what your real subject is? It is freedom." The fortress of formalist abstraction had been so reinforced and armoured over the previous 2 decades that any effective challenge had to come from inside. For Guston, the immediate consequences were catastrophic. The Marlborough Gallery dropped him, and he found himself excommunicated as a traitor and a heretic. They said I was finished. Some painters of the abstract movement, my colleagues, friends, contemporaries, refused to talk to me. For several more years, Guston had difficulty exhibiting or selling. With hindsight, it is obvious that standing, smoking, eating, paintings, smoking, eating, could only have been created by an artist steeped in the scale and handling of American abstraction. The other new varieties of figuration that emerged after 1960 often had Abex buried somewhere in their foundations. The ambition, the seriousness, the sense of the tragic all carried over into history painters as various as R.B. Kitaj and Leon Golub, Ida Appelbrug and Anselm Kiefer. Yet almost all the artists that he goes on to discuss were motivated by a need to challenge the exclusionary and restrictive ideology constructed around abstract expressionism. Guston's quest to tear off the mask of abstraction became a paradigm for a new generation from the 1980s onwards. How are we doing? Okay. So I wanted to conclude our segment of Hyman's readings, not with a broad generalized statement about history painting and the move within New York against a kind of official orthodoxy, but to actually give a better characterization of Timothy Hyman's project, to go right outside of New York, as far from New York as you can get, to India in the 1960s and 70s, to Baroda, yes, to bring back the lost reality of the world, a quote from Bhupen Kaka, An Indian Experience. Much of the history of 20th century painting, and he has an epigraph from Bhupen Kaka from 1978, an artist must be vulnerable, his paintings must reflect all his weak points. Much of the history of 20th century painting could be retold as a narrative of artists who, having long since ruled out the option of naturalism, were nevertheless impelled to create a world of figures, to reconstitute the world anew. That was the dilemma facing Bhupen Kaka, as it had been for Guston, Cara, and Leger before him, when, at the end of the 1960s, he tested one mode after another. Could he shape a figurative idiom equivalent to his experience? Around 1972, Kaka's pictorial language gelled. All its hybrid elements fell into place. It was as though a door suddenly opened onto a vista no painter had penetrated before, the vast terrain of half-westernized modern India. By the early 1970s, Kaka was seen, together with others of his Baroda generation, as an indigenist. India's leading young critic, Geeta Kapoor, was questioning the relevance of internationalism to the needs of Indian painters. Internationalism and formalism have accompanied each other and have, for all the claims of avant-gardism, made art conformist and conventional. My point of view is that internationalism as a cult imposes upon the individual artist, and especially outside the Western metropolis, a set of false imperatives that need to be examined. Kaka would need to jettison the tyranny of internationalist aesthetics to unlearn received ideas of good taste. If he was to enter into the reality of that class, he wanted not only to depict, but to represent. The over-life-size effigy in Man with Bouquet of Plastic Flowers from 1976 is funereal, a messenger from the grave, zombie eyes and a darkened face. This painting is about a milieu and an absence, an icon and altarpiece to a life misspent, to a death in life. The double scale relates both to Indian uplift posters, for example of Gandhi amid his deeds, and to the Italian Vita icon, where the saint stands among his miracles. Later that year, visiting Europe for the first time, Kaka identified most with the 14th century Sienese painters. The early Italians, quote, "The early Italians faced certain problems which I face also as a painter, how to include the narrative elements in a painting without destroying its structure. He loved their diffidence, a timidness in their work. They're trying to evolve a language for the first time, a kind of meekness." In Italy again, in 1979, his travel companion was Howard Hodgkin. They stood together in Mantegna's frescoed Camera degli Sposi and challenged one another to enlarge their scale. 2 years later, the panoramic townscape of You Can't Please All is at once an homage to Ambrogio Lorenzetti, the retelling of an ancient fable employing the continuous narration of the Sienese, and a far more urgent and personal theme, which is embodied in the watcher who has come out onto the balcony and sees the fabled unfolding below him. At 47, Kaka painted himself just standing naked before everyone. This coming out is still half covert, though there are other clues. Why, when the donkey makes its second appearance, is it sporting an enormous erection? The artist's sly response, because he is carrying two men. Kaka's gradual pictorial coming out over the course of the 1980s may have been the most courageous act of his life. Up to 1975, I felt that if my friends knew I am gay, I was prepared to commit suicide. Homosexuality had remained invisible in Indian culture, unrepresented even in novels and films. Kaka found himself once again painting on behalf of a constituency hitherto unregarded, unrecorded. His art became explicitly confessional, though the self is always juxtaposed to some larger context. At the end of the 1970s, Geeta Kapoor was writing of a new generation of Indian painters who sought to bring back the lost reality of the world, moving away from the painting as autonomous object towards a more societal art. Two Men in Benares is another divided and double-scale image. A lyrical golden landscape with sadhus and small shrines among trees is set against Kaka's naked embrace of a bearded stranger. The sexual is located in the sacred. Great. Well, there is a good little taste of Timothy Hyman's The World New Made, figurative painting in the 20th century. Perhaps now that our audience has a more vivid sense of this book, its scope, its style, the artist's very personal idiom, we can take our gloves off a little Julie and David, and begin to say what we find really compelling about this book, what we find our troubles with it are. I'm particularly curious to ask the two of you, because I've known Timothy for many years. I've heard him lecture over the years. I've seen some of these ideas take shape. And of course, I knew him in the UK, so British artists were the starting point for us. Does this seem to you a very English perspective?
Well, it certainly does to me, in that, and I'm sure everyone in this room would have their own range of people that you'd want to put in a book if you were writing such a book. There are a number of artists that, like Edward Burra and William Roberts, who most Americans would never have heard of. And similarly, we could probably name dozens of American artists that Timothy hasn't, and that we would probably want to mention in passing at least, that aren't here. But I also feel that in the larger sense, there is, well, Timothy to me, well, as Godard is the anti-French filmmaker of French film, Timothy is the anti-British figurative painter.
Yes, so we're not only an American view of a very English writer, but an acknowledgement of the marginal place within an English discourse. Would you go on that, Julie?
I'm curious if I did look up his painting because I didn't know it.
Yes.
And I understand that it's revered enough in England, but I also think it's interesting that most people I spoke to about his work hadn't heard of him.
Right.
And it made me wonder how much he was righting the wrongs of his own personal pick, perhaps, at not gaining a larger audience.
Yeah. Well, again, speaking personally, I'm a proud possessor of several of his etchings, and I think he's a very decent painter. I think, it's dignified that he does not include his own painting in this volume. He was elected to the Royal Academy in 2011, but I would say pretty much on the strength of his criticism. I mean, he is a painter. He's a very committed, dedicated painter. I think every page of this book is permeated by the sense that only a painter could have written this book, especially its attention to technique and materiality, never from a formalist perspective, always from an imagery and expressive perspective, but nonetheless, it's a painter's way of writing. But no, I think I think that even if there was a radical change of perspective and the whole world came to see art history through Timothy Hyman's eyes, Timothy's paintings will probably still remain as marginal as, say, Roger Fry's paintings were in the heyday of Roger Fry's formalist hegemony.
But he has there's a point in here where he's gotten up to the 1980s, and he completely dismisses the trans avant-garde movement as a minor movement, and I think he's right there. But I think that there is as much interest, I feel as much interest in somebody as sort of second-rate, may I say, as Enzo Kuki, as this guy. It's the arbitrariness of who's your hero and who's your bête noire. I don't know. That's not arbitrary at all. It's a well-honed opinion.
Well, yes, it's a well-honed, but it would strike us, I think, as when you hear, say, Jed Pearl fulminate against the degeneracy of our times, we said, but all is not lost, and he'll bring up some artists, and the artist looks to us, pretty typical of the times that he's
But
condemning.
the book is such a
Yes.
wonderful book, but
Yeah.
it's and we're getting to the critical part, and I don't know
Yes.
if it's too
That's fine.
soon,
No, no.
but it's so marred by
Yes.
this subjectivity, this I want to get my friends in there. The only centerfold that he gives, or double spread, is Ken Kiff, who is seriously a marginal artist.
Yes.
But then again, this is a book about championing the marginal
Right.
and trying to find artists, many of which have a kind of saturnine, poetic vision that tries for a kind of transcendence.
Yes.
It's not a book about championing the marginal.
Oh, I don't agree.
It's a book about all of those urges that artists maintain in their spirit to bring the inside out, and all these marvelous ways that artists, in the 20th century have done it. Exquisite examples from, Enzor to Kitai. And then there's Kakar,
There's also Henry Darger and Charlotte
Henry
Salomon.
Darger is one of a great modernists. I love the moment where
You can love Darger to bits, but he's not any kind of modernist.
I agree.
he's not any kind of modernist.
No. He may be modern, but he's not a modernist. So as soon as you call Henry Darger a modernist, you may be praising Henry Darger, but you've lost any sense of modernism.
That's completely not true. Darger is one of the really great formalists. I mean, he imbued his formalism with subject matter too. But when you squint your eyes and just look at the formal properties of a Darger, it's all about negative space and the flattening.
Having formal properties is not the same as being a formalist.
Well,
Having formal properties is not synonymous with being a formalist.
but he constructed his vision with that idea of recognizing the power of a shape.
Yes.
To both be an interesting shape that embodies an idea within itself.
Yeah, but the outsider artist, the genuinely outsider artist, by which one means, say, the psychotic artist who's just pretty clueless about what's going on in contemporary art, like Henry Darger, he's painting from inner necessity. He's drawing on some wellsprings that the modernist artist, with the modernist artist's reverence for child art and psychotic art, is envious of. But then to say, therefore, it's then putting the cart before the cart horse to say that the psychotic outsider is a modernist because he's doing what modernists would like to be doing. I think...
If you're doing it, you're doing it. You know, he pulled it off.
No, historical intentionality can't quite be suppressed that conveniently, I would suggest. But anyway, this might be a little bit of a detour, but it's good that Hyman has got us debating such detours.
There's a wonderful quote. Balthus is talking to David Sylvester about Bonnard, and saying to him, if David Sylvester didn't think the greatest artist of the century wasn't Bonnard instead of Matisse, we had nothing further to say to one another. The idea of being, that kind of underscores this idea of it's Matisse is the great formalist, but Bonnard was doing so many weird things using formalism too, and subject matter within the formalism.
Right. Okay. David, would you agree with that characterization, the distinction between Bonnard and Matisse? Do you think that's what Balthus was saying to David Sylvester?
Well, I think it was certainly the kind of thing he would say to try to put David on notice that he was going to not brook any kind of...
My way or the highway.
Exactly.
Yes.
And
But
Balthus is well known for that, and coming with a series of put-downs if you couldn't play with him the way he would like you to be.
So would Balthus's beef with Matisse be that he was an institutionalized success, and his veneration of Bonnard have to do with the fact that power politics of art world in the 20th century had somewhat marginalized Bonnard in relation to Picasso and Matisse? Or is there something intrinsic to Bonnard's project with which Balthus feels a special affinity?
I think certainly the latter, but I also think it was a way of casting a stone at David himself, given David's criticism, which Balthus would have known.
Right.
So it's partly that, but I think in the case of Balthus, whose vision, certainly as Timothy characterizes it, is the vision of childhood, that it in itself, like Bonnard, is a symbolist vision, a vision of epiphanies, a vision of images where some special moment happens if you can open yourself to see it, at least in the best paintings.
Let's talk about Tim's politics here, Timothy's politics here a bit. I think there's his art politics, but then there's his politics as well. I think there's quite a veneration that runs through this book for, and certainly whenever many artists' politics are brought into play, the anarchism particularly, which Timothy himself espouses, gets, if you're an anarchist, there's a little halo that goes around your head, and then when he's really kind of locking horns with Edward Hopper, he can't help mentioning that he's a Republican. So that there's...
and a dour one at that.
A dour Republican, yes. Of course, to be a Republican in the 1920s and 30s had a different meaning, but what is there a little subtext of is there a kind of political revolt running through the pages of this book in some way?
Yeah, I think there is early on a discussion about the longing for a golden age.
Right.
He writes about Matisse, and all the way through there are moments of talking about various artists about the necessary torment to release or to retrieve some vision that might bring us back to or look to the future of some impossible golden age.
Yeah. Well, also the idea of cubist fracturing didn't have the same power after the whole world had been fractured by the wars.
Yes.
So.
Yeah, the retrenchment of the avant-garde, the turn to classicism in particular, in the Parisian avant-garde, Léger, Picasso, Stravinsky, Cocteau and company, that's essentially, that's usually perceived as a kind of conservatism, that an avant-garde had been an extreme of modernity, and that modernity had discredited itself through the alienation of labor and through the catastrophe of the First World War, and that a more humanist, a more tender kind of aesthetics would be one that draw on a more conservative and a more wholesome kind of totality. But I don't think that would be Hyman's aesthetics or philosophy, would it? Or would it? Do you think he's presenting a kind of, that would be more the line of, say, a critic like Peter Fuller? Do you think that Timothy Hyman is arguing for wholeness, lyricism, observation from a kind of wholesome point of view, or do you think that he's in fact, on the contrary, seeing figuration, the figuration that he's arguing for, as having a more biting or subversive element?
You want me to answer?
Yeah.
I think the answer for me is that what hovers underneath everything is Mikhail Bakhtin's Carnivalesque.
Right.
And that sense of the comic grotesque as a way of mirroring up the ugliness of the world and suggesting the need for something other than what's there,
Yes.
politically speaking. Yeah.
Yeah, the Carnivalesque comes across very often, doesn't it, in the discussions of Guston, who we're looking at, but even, connections there between...
And his love of Gilray and
Yes.
Caricature is part of that.
And the
certainly.
scatological is not afraid of any
He
discussion
loves
of bodily
the
fluid. He
scatological.
loves.
And in fact, a show that few people probably have seen outside of the UK, was a touring show he did called Carnivalesque,
Right.
in which a whole series of northern art that had eschatological aspects were presented, which brings us perhaps to the issue that a lot of Hyman's aesthetic is really a kind of northern European
Yes.
aesthetic.
Mm-hmm.
But maybe you'd like to talk.
No, I think so. There's a bias towards expressionism.
And a bias against classicism.
And a bias against France to some extent, even though
France
Bonnard,
and Italy, for that
Yes.
matter, in certain
Right.
ways.
even though Bonnard is his great hero, and even though Leger and Chagall get good play at the beginning, there's generally a sense of yanking that. There's generally a sense that official modernism, with its absurd veneration of Paris, has to have a corrective that yanks us further north and perhaps west or east of Paris, having Soutine on the cover, for instance, although he lived in the south of France, which complicates things. But
No, I suspect that the publishers probably chose that image.
yes,
I'm
that's
not
true. Uh,
sure what he would have chosen, but
That could be the whole subject of an evening's discussion.
Yeah.
So the corrective, there's definitely a revisionism. Revisionism runs through the whole course of this project, doesn't it? That it's but doesn't to be writing in the second decade of the 21st century from a revisionist perspective does entail believing that the orthodoxy is to a considerable extent still in place. And so I wonder if in his lifelong quest for championing the marginal, the outsider, whether to any extent Timothy Hyman depends on a kind of straw man that's not there anymore.
well, we have Nicole Eisenman here yesterday, and Dana Schutz is certainly not doing too shabbily.
Right.
So there is, at least here, some reason for that. But I'm not so sure.
Right.
I'm not so sure that isn't, as with our civil rights, a continuous struggle for women artists, for all sorts of issues, certainly African-American artists. We've just had a wonderful James Carey Marshall show, but it's the first one. You know, and before that, we had Roma Bearden, 2 or 3 people. Have we just had a Norman Lewis show? People who've been dead for 30 years. So how free from all of those constraints are we really?
Well, let's give the Brooklyn Museum some credit for Wangechi Mutu and Micheline Thomas.
Yes, excellent. It's a beginning.
Yeah, and let's also give Timothy Hyman credit for a nice discussion on Jacob Lawrence, although it is telling, I mean, although we will count Bhupen Kaka into the mix, into the head count, it is telling that it's a rather predominantly white and male selection. It's interesting that he says in his preface, he gives a whole list of, he regrets the relative absence of women in the book, although Alice Neal and Charlotte Salomon and
But he
Paul
does
Merson
list
Becker.
a lot of contemporary women artists
He lists
who
contemporary
are
women
21st
artists.
century
Yes.
careers,
Right, Eisenman and
among them. Yeah.
Schutz being among them.
But there are a number of English women as well
Yes.
that are in that list. Yeah.
Yes. It struck me, though, that he was a little bit disingenuous there because, he's sort of covering himself by saying, I acknowledge these great women, but they're 21st century. Couldn't he have been less loyal to the Gregorian calendar and a little more loyal to gender equity and actually just brought his book up to 2015 and then included some of those women?
And that great Enzor is from 1887, so he wasn't too worried
yes,
about
that's
that.
true.
He can break the rules that way.
Well,
Yeah.
Yes.
that's true, but remember, this is a personal selection. It's
Yes.
not a survey, truly. Despite what the cover might suggest, it is a personal selection. And so, as I said earlier, it's a self-portrait, not something that's about what ought to be, but what was for me.
Right, right.
And I think we have to cut some slack for that, because it is a kind of autobiography.
Yeah.
Well,
May not be your autobiography.
Yeah, I think it's a mixed
Or
thing. I think
mine.
maybe we should be blaming Thames and Hudson. If they could say 20th century figuration, a personal view, it would let Hyman off the hook
Right.
and make it more about Hyman. But then the reader would say, who the heck is Timothy Hyman, and want to see more and know more about Timothy Hyman. So it's a catch-22 there.
It is.
I guess I take it personally, because figuration is, in its, to a certain extent, it is still slightly marginalized, just because there's so much bad done in the name of figuration, that when an argument is watered down by poor examples, mediocre examples, I feel as though it's going to delegitimize a book that I think has done a lot to really beautifully argue for the state of, bringing the inside out that figurative artists want to engage with.
Yeah.
So that's why I
Took issue with Bhupen Kakar and Kenkif. Yeah, I think that's fair enough. For him, it's the pay is to be able to put forward these people he feels passionate about, but the drawback of that is it, to us, somewhat diminishes perhaps the strength of the argument. But I think that many artists, whatever they do, even in fact many conceptual or abstract painters, will derive enormous succor from just the strength and intelligence of argument and the organization of ideas and materials. I think if one has a anti-academic or anti-modernist perspective, but doesn't happen to be making figurative art, that you'll think of Hyman as an ally rather than his being exclusively a figurative painting man. Is that a fair, or is that an overly ideal view? Do you think somebody who's not a figurative painter would see in Hyman an intellectual or moral ally because of the strength of his arguments for the marginalized, the outsider, the personal, the non-academic?
I think, I feel that in some ways, in photography and installation and performance art, these very themes that Hyman talks about have been the arena in which they have been talked about, and Hyman's book is very much an attempt to put them back into painting.
Right. So should they be acknowledging that actually some of the impetus of those things is coming from other mediums?
Well, I think any artist, regardless of what you do, can draw from any of the arts, and I was always frustrated with students who weren't interested in the arts outside of what they did. I think that collective energy and intelligence is what allows you to move forward in surprising ways. So yes, I do.
He has a very nice line where he says, Hyman says, cinema can fling imagery around, it can simulate dreams, it can create a rhythm, but it cannot become part of the stillness of a wall. And, we're always looking for justifications for painting in terms of the commodification, the problem of it and all that.
Yes.
But that's just so beautifully said.
Beautiful, fantastic. I think it would be a good moment to bring in the audience. If there are any questions or comments, we can have those for some period. And then I think the panel would certainly like to wrap up in some